Hello again. I caused quite a bit of irritation recently when I expressed scepticism about the idea that there was some sinister master plan whereby Europe and North America were to be annihilated by the destruction of their very identity. People sent me links and so on, all of which I have sedulously examined. Um, I remain unconvinced. I'm aware that some will claim that this is because I view the world through philo-Semitic spectacles, but I think there's more to it than that. I can see a far simpler explanation for what's going on with the BBC, advertising industry and so on, one which requires no puppet masters to be orchestrating a well-planned strategy to destroy our way of life. The dialectical process alone accounts adequately for all we are seeing and is sufficient by itself to explain what is taking place in Britain and other parts of the Western world, such as the United States. When one's very strong idea is overthrown, there will not be an ideological vacuum. Another idea will rush in to replace it. Usually this will not be a new and moderate view, but something which is a diametrical opposite of the idea which has just fallen from favour. The German philosopher Hegel wrote that history is mind clothing itself with the form of events, which is a lot more simple than it sounds. He means that ideologies, religions, political theories and so on play themselves out on the world stage by the actions of those who support them. This is a dialectical view of history. It might help those of us who are struggling to make sense of what seems to be an ideology running counter to all the available evidence, which is the equalitarian doctrine. The idea of dialectics in history is a really simple one. When one political system, religion or philosophy, becomes strongly entrenched in a society, a movement often emerges which is in direct opposition to the existing ideology, to the ruling ideology, on almost every point. So dictatorships often give birth or bring forth an opposition which demands democracy. Religious intolerance creates demands for freedom of conscience and so on. When these opposites clash, there often develops a new system which incorporates the best points of the two opposing ideas or ideologies. So the old way of seeing the world and the radical notions which try and overthrow that worldview come together, and eventually something new emerges, but the process is seldom smooth and often lengthy. In technical terms, the original ideas, methods or system are known as the thesis, and the opposing set of beliefs as the antithesis. The resulting new arrangement, when it eventually emerges, is, with the best parts of both, is called the synthesis. This idea might be new to some viewers, so a real life instance of how it works might be helpful. Between 1625 and 1649, England was ruled by Charles I, who became increasingly autocratic. He simply ran the show by himself and he didn't appreciate anybody's help. He felt that he had a divine right to do as he pleased, the divine right of kings. He didn't have any use at all for anything which smacked at all of democracy. On the scaffold, moments before he was executed by having his head chopped off, he explained with great succinctness his own view of government. He said, I must tell you that the liberty and freedom of the people consist in having of government those laws by which their life and their goods may be most their own. It is not for having a share in government, sir. That is nothing pertaining to them. A subject and a sovereign are clean different things. It's not really to be wondered at that the movement which overthrew the king and sent him to his death should have been opposed on principle to all kings and subsequently declared a republic in England. Here we see perfectly two ideas clashing, one against the other, with the rebellion and armed resistance eventually developing in what is known today as the English Civil War. It might have been thought that it would have been an idea to simply replace the autocratic monarchy with a more moderate system, a constitutional monarchy perhaps. It might be better than killing the king and installing a very harsh and repressive republic. But that's not how things generally work. First, there's a battle between those who represented the opposing theories, and when one was triumphant, it would rule society, at least for a spell. However, in the case of the English Civil War, within a few years, the antithesis gave way to a synthesis of the two sides, which had championed very different ideas. The Republic would pass away, King would be invited back to rule the land. This was Charles I's son, King Charles II, and although he was stripped of a lot of his power and authority, the best parts of the royalist and parliamentarian ideologies were retained and the extreme parts abandoned. So the new regime of Charles II can be thought of as a compromise. It was a compromise between the two things. It was the beginning of a constitutional monarchy. So the idea of a fierce republic had been dropped, the idea of an autocratic king had been dropped, and there was a kind of compromise which ended up in the sort of democracy there is today in Britain. The case of England after its civil war in the 17th century has been looked at fairly closely for the light which it sheds on all such dialectical processes in history. In the present case, until a few decades after the Second World War, most ordinary people in Britain and America still had the idea that there were inherent differences between various ethnic groups. This often showed itself in a virulent and active dislike of black people. In other words, the fact that black people and white people are different was demonstrated by means of prejudice and discrimination and hostility towards black people. In Britain, for example, there was a great distaste at the idea of mixed marriages. Most people disapproved of them. Renting a flat to a black person was regarded as a very risky and undesirable undertaking. In America, schools were segregated. Protesting against apartheid in South Africa was regarded as being something that only cranks and disaffected students would do. Racial prejudice was very common and manifested itself in the most unpleasant ways. Not only that, but black people were airbrushed out of images, sometimes literally, because nobody wanted to see them. Nobody wanted to see black people represented anywhere. All the models seemed to be white. Almost every film seemed to be only about white people. And if you'd looked through magazines and newspapers in the 1980s, you might have been forgiven for thinking that black people didn't exist. Because there was so much injustice, so much racism and discrimination, the movement gradually gained momentum to change the way that black people were treated. The sensible thing, of course, would be to say that black people would be treated like everybody else and given equal opportunities with no discrimination against them, which would be quite reasonable. But that's not how history works. It was inevitable that when change did come, it would be precisely the opposite of the old way of doing things, and also very extreme in its opposition. Here, let me give an example, see if I can make this a little bit plainer. A former dean of Yale Medical School had a rule for admissions of minorities. He said, never admit more than 5 Jews, take only 2 Italian Catholics, and take no blacks at all. Right, it was obviously and grotesquely unfair to prevent black people from entering Yale Medical School. The sensible way to change that would be to say, okay, we'll admit black people if they have the qualifications, and we'll make sure they're treated equally in the admissions process. Of course, that's not actually what happened. The situation is now precisely reversed, from not admitting any black students to admitting as many black students as possible. This is as loopy as admitting none at all, of course. It's exactly the opposite of the old system. We've gone from having no black people at all in advertisements, which was certainly the case a few decades ago, to having almost nothing but black people in advertisements, as I have pointed out here and other people have noticed. You see, it's the exact opposite. A few years ago, it was only white people and no black people at all. And these days, a lot of advertisements is all black people and there's no white people. We see this all over society now in so many different ways. The situation is almost exactly the opposite of what it was. This isn't some fiendish plot run by the Jews to destroy Western civilization. It's simply how history works. First the thesis, then the antithesis. In this case, first racism, and then the precisely opposite idea, the equalitarian dogma, takes over and now rules the roost, which is the position we are in now. Eventually, there'll be a synthesis, and the best parts of both ideas will be kept and the foolish and unjust bits dropped. A new situation will emerge, although this might take decades. I find the present situation, the present position, as annoying as everybody else, and I hope that change comes hastily. But it's honestly not a conspiracy at work, it's simply history, going through its usual procedures.